December 20th, 1943. At 26,000 feet above northern Germany, the air was thin, cold, and filled with smoke. The formation of B-17s from the 379th Bomb Group had been airborne for nearly 5 hours, flying in tight, deliberate patterns toward their target, the industrial facilities of Bremen. Below them, the gray expanse of cloud obscured the cities and rivers, but the Germans knew they were coming. The first flak bursts had already risen through the haze, black flowers blooming against the pale winter sky. The aircraft known as Hell's Wager flew on the outer edge of the formation, the vulnerable tail position pilots called Coffin Corner. It was a flying fortress in name and appearance, a block of steel and aluminum moving through the sky, its engines vibrating the entire fuselage like a living creature. Frost clung to its glass nose and gun turrets. Inside, the men were quiet, focused. They had learned that talking invited distraction, and distraction could mean death. As they approached the bombing run, the radio crackled with terse coordinates and target confirmations. Then came the sound every crew dreaded, the hollow metallic punch of anti-aircraft shells bursting near the formation. The plane jolted. Shrapnel tore through the right wing, severing cables and rupturing a fuel line. Flames licked across the surface before the freezing wind extinguished them. The crew felt the shudder ripple through the frame, but the engines held. Within seconds, a second burst struck home. The number 4 engine, the outer right, erupted in sparks and smoke. The pilot, Lieutenant Mason, throttled back and feathered the propeller, watching the RPMs drop to 0. The aircraft lurched to one side, losing altitude. He fought the control column, forcing the fortress level again. The other planes continued on, still locked in their bombing run. There was no time to help. When the bomb bay doors opened, the wind howled through the fuselage. Bombs fell into the gray distance, disappearing into the clouds below. Moments later, the formation turned west for the long flight home. Hell's Wager lagged behind, crippled, its right wing bleeding fuel and hydraulic fluid. Then came the fighters. German interceptors, Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, rose from airfields near Oldenburg, their silver-gray fuselages flashing in the sunlight. They climbed in 2s and 3s, using the sun for cover. The gunner spotted them first, dark specks moving fast, cutting through contrails like hawks descending on prey. The first pass came from 12 o'clock high, head-on, cannon fire stitching across the sky. The plexiglass nose shattered, shards flying through the cockpit. The bombardier was hit. The left inboard engine began to overheat. The fortress fell further behind. Its once-tight formation, the only protection a bomber had, now drifted away into the haze. At 21,000 feet, alone over enemy territory, the B-17 was surrounded. Cannon shells ripped through the fuselage, tearing holes the size of fists. One-tail gunner returned fire, his twin .50 caliber Brownings glowing red in the freezing air. Tracers arced through the smoke, brief orange lines fading into gray. The radio operator sent a brief signal, position, altitude, damage. Then silence. The German fighters circled again. When the next attack came, it was concentrated and merciless. The right wing was struck again, a 20mm shell exploding near the spar. Metal folded. A section of the wing, nearly 6 feet long, sheared away entirely, trailing smoke as it tumbled into the clouds. The fortress shuddered violently, nearly rolling inverted before the pilot regained control. Inside, oxygen masks hung loose, wires sparked, and frost formed over bloodstains. From the ground, farmers in the frozen fields of northern Germany looked up and saw a crippled bomber limping westward, one wing clearly damaged, smoke trailing from its fuselage. It should not have been flying at all. At 15,000 feet, the fighters broke away. They had done their work. The crippled American was no longer a threat, its bomb load spent, its crew wounded. For a moment, There was quiet, only the low moan of wind through holes in the fuselage. But the fortress did not fall. Lieutenant Mason trimmed the surviving engines, compensating for drag, adjusting trim tabs that no longer responded properly. Each movement of the control column felt slow, delayed, like steering through thick oil. The crew stabilized what was left of the plane. The instruments flickered erratically. The horizon tilted unevenly in the cockpit windows. Behind them, the air was full of smoke and flame. Below them, Germany stretched endless and indifferent. The crew could not see England yet, but they held westward toward the fading sun. At 12,000 feet, they crossed over another belt of flak. Explosions bloomed below them, filling the gaps left by the retreating fighters. One burst caught the tail directly, shredding the stabilizer and sending fragments through the rear fuselage. The tail gunner's position was destroyed, his gun silent. The plane pitched violently before Mason corrected again, his knuckles white on the yoke. Every minute, something failed. The compass spun. The hydraulic pressure dropped. Fuel drained from ruptured tanks faster than the pumps could transfer it. The temperature in the fuselage dropped below freezing. Breath condensed on the metal walls, forming small icicles that trembled with each vibration of the engines. Still, they stayed in the air. To the crews in the returning formation, the crippled bomber was a fading shadow on the horizon, smoke trailing behind like a torn banner. No one expected it to reach the North Sea. Planes that damaged never did. As daylight began to fade, Hell's Wager passed over the edge of the cloud cover. For the first time since the bombing run began, the crew saw the ground below, a patchwork of rivers, snow-dusted fields, and frozen forests stretching endlessly toward the west. The broken wing groaned with every gust, threatening to give way entirely. Inside the cockpit, the sound was deafening, metal groaning, engines roaring unevenly, the constant whine of the wind through open seams. The smell of oil, smoke, and gunpowder mixed with the cold. Every vibration was a question. Would it hold for another minute, another mile? And yet, mile by mile, the crippled B-17 crawled westward. The navigator calculated their position with half-working instruments. They were over enemy territory, deep in northern Germany, with more than 200 miles between them and the safety of the North Sea. The remaining fuel was barely enough for 1 hour of flight. The weight of the aircraft, lightened by ammunition and damage, kept it barely aloft. The pilot reduced power to conserve fuel. The engines sputtered, then steadied. Every adjustment was delicate, every movement measured. The right wing, its outer section gone, flexed dangerously under the strain. They should have bailed out. That was the logical decision. Yet none of them moved. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps faith, or simply the instinct that as long as the engines still turned, as long as the horizon still tilted west, they might yet see England again. Below them, the rivers curved toward the sea. The clouds gathered again. Night began to fall. The fortress, mortally wounded, flew on to be why the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had entered its most brutal phase. The American 8th Air Force, newly established in England only a year earlier, had begun its relentless daylight bombing campaign against the German industrial heartland. The idea was simple and terrifying: cripple the Reich's ability to wage war by destroying its factories, shipyards, and fuel supplies. But the cost of that strategy was written every day across the gray skies of Northern Europe. Each mission sent hundreds of bombers across occupied territory. Slow, heavy aircraft flying in tight formation, exposed to fighters, flak, and the merciless cold of high altitude. Crews called the long flights milk runs with bitter irony, because few ever returned unscathed. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed for endurance. Its thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and 12 or more .50 caliber machine guns made it the symbol of American air power. But no machine could withstand what awaited it above Germany. The Luftwaffe's defenses were well organized, guided by radar and supported by dense belts of anti-aircraft artillery. Once the bombers crossed into hostile airspace, there was no escape, only a long, mechanical endurance of terror. In the months before the Bremen raid, entire squadrons had been wiped from the sky. On missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, losses reached nearly 1 in 4. For the men who flew, survival became a lottery. They calculated their odds not in victories, but in missions flown. 25. That was the number they had to complete before being sent home. Most never reached it. Each morning, the bases of eastern England came alive before dawn. Engines roared to life across frozen runways. Ground crews loaded bombs and ammunition in the half-light. In the mess halls, young men ate silently, glancing at weather maps and listening for the code names that would send them into the sky again. The sound of those briefings lingered long after takeoff. Coordinates, altitudes, speeds, targets, recited like the final verses of prayer. When Wager joined its formation on December 20th, 1943, it carried 10 men. Most of them were barely in their 20s. They had flown together for 8 missions already, bonded by fear and the fragile trust that only those who faced death together could understand. Each man had a station: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and gunners. Each knew that his survival depended entirely on the discipline of the others. The mission that day was to strike the Focke-Wulf aircraft assembly plants in Bremen, a critical target protected by one of the densest flak defenses in northern Germany. The attack would take them deep into hostile territory, far beyond the range of friendly escort fighters. In the planning rooms of East Anglia, intelligence officers drew red lines on maps showing known enemy positions. The men studied them in silence. They knew that those red lines marked not geography, but probability, the invisible boundary between chance and inevitability. The first waves of bombers left England in formation at dawn. The airfield was covered in frost. As the sun rose, contrails streaked the sky in long white arcs stretching eastward over the North Sea. From the ground, they looked almost peaceful. But above the clouds, the war was waiting. At 20,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks froze to skin. Machine guns jammed from frost. The thin air hissed through small openings in the fuselage. Everything smelled of oil, metal, and sweat. Over the coast of Germany, the formations tightened. The sky ahead was already dark with the bursts of flak. It rose in perfect rhythm, timed by radar and experience, filling the air with black puffs that drifted slowly like smoke from invisible fires. Inside the bombers, men counted the seconds between flashes, each burst closer than the last. The 8th Air Force called this phase the flak corridor. Crews called it the Black Wall. For the Germans on the ground, the bombers were both fear and fascination. Vast machines moving through the clouds in perfect formation, shining silver in the sun. Each one carried thousands of pounds of high explosive. Each one represented an entire crew of men who might not live to see the next sunrise. In Bremen, sirens wailed as civilians and factory workers ran for cover. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from emplacements outside the city, their concussions echoing through frozen streets. The sky filled with smoke and vapor trails. The first bombs fell shortly after noon, raining through layers of cloud toward the industrial zones along the Weser River. For the men aboard Wager, the mission unfolded as they had been trained to expect: precision, procedure, discipline. But no amount of training could change the fact that war in the air was a contest between machines, chance, and the limits of human endurance. When the bomber formation turned west after releasing their loads, the Luftwaffe was already in the air. Dozens of German fighters scrambled from bases near Oldenburg and Vechta, climbing to intercept. The timing was perfect. The Americans were turning for home, heavy, low on fuel, and most vulnerable. Within minutes, the formation disintegrated. Smoke trails marked where bombers had been hit. Parachutes bloomed like pale flowers against the blue sky. Radio chatter filled with static and panic. Each formation fought to hold its shape, to maintain the illusion of control, even as the world collapsed around them. In that chaos, one damaged B-17 began to fall behind. The other saw it briefly through gaps in the smoke, its right wing torn, its engines sputtering, its contrails uneven. Then it vanished into the haze. At that altitude, isolation meant death. The bombers depended on mutual firepower, interlocking fields of machine gun fire that could deter even the most determined enemy. Alone, a single B-17 was easy prey. The Luftwaffe pilots had seen this many times before. They knew the patterns: crippled bombers drifting west, crews struggling to keep altitude. They called them Fliegen Todmänner, the flying dead men. Yet even the Germans respected the stubbornness of these machines. Many had witnessed fortresses continue flying long after they should have fallen, their wings shredded, their crews half dead. It was a kind of mechanical defiance, something both tragic and awe-inspiring. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign was testing the limits of both nations. The Americans believed in precision and persistence, that enough bombs, dropped with enough accuracy, could break the enemy's will. The Germans believed in endurance, that no amount of bombing could destroy a people's resolve. Between those beliefs, the skies became a graveyard. The 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men during the war, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. For every mission that returned safely, another ended in smoke and twisted metal across the fields of France or the forests of Germany. And yet they continued. Every morning, the formations rose again, like clockwork, engines droning across the channel toward the same horizon. Each flight a gamble, each return a miracle. The story of Hell's Wager was not unique, not in the numbers of casualties or the scale of destruction. What made it remarkable was that it should have been one more line in a casualty report, one more wreck among thousands. Instead, it became a symbol of something far more enduring: the will to survive when logic said survival was impossible. In the long record of the air war, the mission of December 20th was officially logged as successful. The target destroyed, enemy resistance heavy, losses acceptable. But the truth was that no statistic could capture what happened between Bremen and the North Sea that day. The battle of endurance fought not between nations or ideologies, but between gravity, metal, and the fragile persistence of the human spirit. As the sun sank over Germany, Hell's Wager limped westward, its engines straining, its crew counting the miles not in numbers, but in heartbeats. The air was filled with the sound of distant engines, the rest of the formation already far ahead. Behind them, the black smoke of Bremen drifted into the night sky. The war was far from over, but for one crippled bomber and the men inside it, the next few hours would decide everything. They were flying into the longest night of their lives. Darkness was falling over northern Germany. The sky had turned the color of lead, streaked with smoke from the burning city far behind. In the fading light, Hell's Wager was a silhouette against the clouds, a wounded shadow dragging itself westward. From a distance, it looked like a plane already dead, flying only by momentum and memory. The right wing, missing nearly 6 feet of its outer section, bent with every gust of wind. The fourth engine was gone, the third coughing intermittently, leaking oil that streamed backward in long black lines. Inside, the crew's oxygen masks hung useless. They had descended below 10,000 feet to breathe without them. It was warmer now, but the air felt thick, heavy, filled with the stench of burnt fuel and cordite. In the cockpit, the instruments flickered weakly. The artificial horizon trembled. The altimeter spun unsteadily. The compass had frozen hours earlier. Lieutenant Mason flew by instinct and by stars when he could see them. His co-pilot sat beside him, scanning the clouds for landmarks that no longer existed. Forests reduced to black smears, villages hidden beneath the haze. They were alone, far behind enemy lines. The navigator calculated their position roughly. At their speed and heading, they might reach the North Sea in 40 minutes. The problem was not distance. It was time. Every second brought new failures. Fuel pressure dropping, control cables fraying, structural vibration worsening. The damaged wing groaned like a living thing, as though protesting the effort of continued flight. Behind the cockpit, the fuselage was a ruin. The radio compartment was half collapsed. The operator's table shattered, his notes scattered across the floor. Bullet holes punctured the walls, letting shafts of red light cut through the smoke from a small electrical fire that still smoldered near the tail. The heat from it kept frost from forming there, a small irony in the frozen night. The waist gunners moved stiffly, their flight suits soaked through with hydraulic fluid and blood. The smell of oil and metal was overwhelming. The wind screamed through torn aluminum, a constant high whistle that drowned all other sounds. Then, out of the low clouds behind them, came a flicker of movement, a shape too small and fast to be friendly. For a moment, they thought it was a bird or debris. Then it banked, and they saw the silhouette clearly. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, sleek and sharp, rising through the haze with its wings catching the dying sunlight. The German pilot had likely spotted them from miles away, a solitary bomber flying low, slow, and wounded. An easy target. He closed in carefully, keeping his altitude advantage, watching the trail of smoke marking the fortress's path. His guns were loaded, his engine clean, his oxygen full. He knew the routine: approach from the rear, align with the blind spot below the tail, and fire. Inside the crippled bomber, the surviving gunners could only watch. Their guns were nearly useless, the tail turret destroyed, the right waist gun jammed, the left with limited ammunition. Even if they could hit the fighter, they could not maneuver enough to aim. The bomber was flying on alone. The German fighter drew closer. At 600 meters, his cannon ports glowed faintly orange. Then, inexplicably, he slowed. He circled once, keeping his distance. Through the haze, he studied the wreck. The tail was shredded, the fuselage torn open in several places. He could see the exposed framework of the wing, the twisted metal where the fourth engine had been ripped away. The markings on the side were still visible. The faded white star inside a blue circle, the insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The bomber was barely flying. He expected it to fall any second, and yet it stayed aloft. He throttled down, moving closer, almost alongside now. The two aircraft drifted together in the cold air. Predator and prey suspended in a moment that defied the logic of war. From his cockpit, the German could see movement inside the fortress. Figures slumped, motionless, or tending to wounded. The tail gunner's position was gone entirely, torn away by flak. The midsection was open to the air. Frost glimmered on the broken frame. He could have ended it with a short burst. It would have been easy. One squeeze of the trigger, and the crippled bomber would have rolled over, spiraling into the forest below. But something stopped him. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps pity, perhaps exhaustion. He eased his plane closer still, enough to see the pilot's window. Inside, two faces turned toward him. There was no movement of guns, no attempt at resistance. The fortress flew straight and level, a ghost held together by stubbornness alone. The German pilot adjusted his trim, flying in formation beside it. The sight was surreal. Two enemies flying wing to wing through the twilight, the silence between them deeper than any sound. For several minutes, they drifted like that. The Germans scanned the sky around them, searching for more bombers or other fighters. There were none, only the wind, the smoke, and the endless gray of the horizon. Then he made a decision. He pulled his aircraft slightly ahead, positioning himself in front of the bomber's nose, a place no sane pilot would stay. He wagged his wings, signaling something unspoken. Then, deliberately, he began to climb. The bomber followed instinctively, rising just enough to clear a low bank of clouds. Below them, German anti-aircraft positions stretched across the countryside, dark shapes camouflaged against the snow. If the gunners below saw the crippled B-17, they would have fired immediately. But they did not. The fighter's presence confused them. No flak gunner would risk hitting one of their own aircraft. The German pilot stayed just ahead of the bomber, using his position to shield it from the ground batteries. Every few seconds, he looked back, ensuring the Americans were still following. They were. Together, they crossed the final miles of German territory. Two planes, one enemy escorting another through hostile airspace. It was an act that defied reason. No one could have seen it without questioning which side they were on. Yet, in that moment, the war seemed to pause, suspended between destruction and compassion. When the coastline appeared below, a faint glimmer of moonlight on the North Sea, the German rolled his plane gently to one side. The gesture was unmistakable. "You are clear." The bomber continued west, low over the water. The fighter remained behind for a moment longer, watching the crippled machine fade into the night. Then, with a final roll, he turned east, back toward the smoke and the war he had momentarily left behind. The American crew never knew his name. They would later argue among themselves about what exactly had happened, whether it had been mercy, curiosity, or fate. But they all remembered the sight of the German plane flying beside them, its pilot's silhouette framed by the glow of the sunset. By then, Hell's Wager was more wreck than aircraft. The right wing trembled visibly, the ribs of its structure exposed like bone. The third engine sputtered once more and died, leaving only two still running. Their propellers glinted weakly in the half-light. At 5,000 feet, the bomber began to lose altitude. The fuel gauges read nearly empty. Below them, the North Sea stretched to the horizon, a black mirror of waves. The crew knew that if they ditched here, the cold would kill them within minutes. And so they continued, inch by inch, holding to the west. The engines coughed, the airframe creaked, the horizon tilted again. Every few seconds, the sound changed, a metallic groan, a new vibration, a warning that the structure was reaching its limit. Still, the fortress stayed in the air. The sea wind struck them head-on, reducing their speed further. The pilot trimmed what remained of the control surfaces, fighting to keep the plane level. The remaining engines roared unevenly, flames flickering from their exhausts. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, was England, home, safety light. They could not see it yet, but they believed in its direction. The navigator estimated another 30 miles to the coast. The radio was dead. They could not call for help. No escort fighters, no radar, no one to guide them home. Only the stars above and the steady vibration beneath their boots. Below, the waves moved in slow, endless rhythm. The reflection of the moon rippled across them, cold and indifferent. They crossed the halfway mark over the sea. The first engine began to sputter, its fuel line coughing air. The pilot throttled back to keep it alive. The bomber shuddered, losing more altitude, 4,000 feet, 3,000. The altimeter needle dipped slowly, then steadied again. Each man aboard knew that at any moment the plane could simply come apart. Yet no one reached for a parachute. They had come too far for that. To jump now would be to surrender to the cold, to the ocean, to the inevitable. And so they stayed with their dying machine. The last miles of the flight were a blur of exhaustion and disbelief. The men had lost all sense of time. The roar of the engines became a constant, hypnotic rhythm. Outside, the horizon had turned from black to deep blue, the faintest hint of dawn approaching from the west. Then, through a break in the clouds, they saw it, the faint outline of land. England. No one spoke, but every man felt it. the shift from despair to fragile hope. The coastline stretched below like a promise, silent and unreal. The bomber descended steadily, the engines barely holding. They had crossed the sea. They had returned from the dead. The first light of dawn was rising over the North Sea, pale and cold. It spread slowly across the horizon, washing the clouds in muted gray. Beneath that light, the crippled bomber moved like a ghost, its engines coughing smoke, its fuselage shaking with each gust of wind. It had been in the air for nearly 9 hours. 9 hours of fire, noise, and endurance that no machine was meant to survive. The English coastline appeared at last, a dark line emerging through morning mist. To the crew inside Hell's Wager, it looked unreal, a mirage, something dreamed rather than seen. The pilot, his face numb with exhaustion, adjusted what little control he still had. The left wing dipped dangerously low, and the bomber banked wide, descending toward the coast. From the ground below, early risers in small Norfolk villages looked up and saw a shape in the sky that did not belong there. The bomber moved slowly, unevenly, one wing jagged and torn. It trailed a thin plume of smoke that caught the morning light like a scar against the clouds. The airfield nearest their course was RAF Thorpe Abbotts, home to another B-17 group. Its control tower crew noticed the approaching aircraft just after 6 in the morning. At first, they thought it was a straggler returning from the Bremen mission. Then they saw the damage. Observers on the ground would later say it looked impossible, a flying fortress with half its right wing missing, engines out, fuselage shredded. It should have been falling. Instead, it came in low, fighting gravity itself, struggling toward the airfield like something dragged back from the grave. The pilot brought it down to 1,500 feet. The landing gear indicators were dead. The hydraulics had failed hours earlier. He cranked the wheels manually, one at a time, his gloved hands slipping on the frozen handles. The right gear locked halfway, tilted at an unnatural angle. It would have to do. The engines roared unevenly as he lined up with the runway. Smoke filled the cockpit. The horizon tilted again, the right wing sagging, the damaged structure flexing under the strain. He corrected gently, unwilling to stress it further. They were nearly there. The ground crew at Thorpe Abbotts raced to clear the runway. Trucks, maintenance carts, and personnel scattered as the crippled bomber descended, its landing lights flickering weakly. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. At 200 feet, the first engine coughed and died. The propeller windmilled once, then froze. The fortress dropped sharply. The remaining engine howled, pulling unevenly to the left. The pilot leveled the wings one last time. Then the plane hit the runway. The left wheel struck first, then the right, half collapsed, throwing sparks. The fuselage bounced, skidded, and slammed back down. Metal shrieked against concrete. The right wingtip, what remained of it, scraped a long scar across the tarmac, scattering fragments like shrapnel. The entire aircraft shuddered as though breaking apart, its frame flexing under forces it was never meant to endure. But stayed whole. The bomber slid nearly 500 feet before grinding to a stop, tilted on one side, smoke curling upward from its broken engines. Silence followed, a silence so complete it seemed unnatural after the endless roar of flight. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then figures began to emerge from the wreck. Men covered in oil and frost, their flight suits torn, their faces pale and hollow. Some limped, some crawled, one carried another. They stumbled into the morning light, blinking as though seeing the world for the first time. The ground crew ran toward them, unsure what they were witnessing. The plane was riddled with holes, its skin peeled back in sections, its tail half gone. The right wing looked as if a giant hand had torn apart. Yet the name on the nose, faded but legible, was still there. Hell's Wager. Medics arrived moments later. They found half the crew wounded, some from shrapnel, others from frostbite and shock. The pilot refused to leave the cockpit until everyone else was clear. When they finally pulled him out, He could barely stand. His flight gloves were frozen to the yoke. The mechanics circled the wreck in disbelief. They had seen damaged aircraft before, bombers returning on one engine, planes with holes in their wings, fuselages split open, but never this. One of them later said it looked as if it had flown through hell and back. The right wing was nearly severed at the root, hanging on by a few twisted beams of metal. Inside the bomb bay, the walls were shredded. The tail section, peppered with flak holes, had been partially burned away. And yet, against all logic, the aircraft had flown more than 200 miles like that. Within hours, word of the landing spread across the base. Crews who had returned from the Bremen mission gathered around the wreck, silent, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and disbelief. Someone said quietly that no man should have survived that flight. Another whispered that the plane must have been carried by something beyond steel and fuel. Later that day, intelligence officers arrived to debrief the surviving crew. Their reports were clinical: times, altitudes, headings, damage assessments. They wrote of the flak bursts over Bremen, the attacks by German fighters, the failure of the engines, the crossing of the North Sea. Nowhere in the paperwork was there mention of the German pilot who had escorted them. Yet every man in that crew remembered him. In the quiet after the landing, the pilot of Hell's Wager sat on a stretcher beside the runway, staring at the sky. He said nothing. The others watched as mechanics inspected the wing, their voices low and disbelieving. The bomber impossibly had held together, torn, twisted, but intact. Later, when engineers examined the structure, they found that the main spar, the spine of the wing, had cracked completely through. Only a few steel cables and fragments of skin had kept it from breaking off entirely. Any additional stress, any turbulence would have destroyed it in seconds. And yet, it had flown through storms, through flak, through fire. News of the incident traveled quickly through the bomber groups stationed in East Anglia. Crews began calling it the ghost that came home. Photographs circulated, grainy, black and white images of the wreck sitting crooked on the runway, its right wing drooping like a wounded arm. To many, it was proof of what they already suspected, that survival in the air was not just a matter of engineering, but something deeper, something inexplicable. In the mess halls that evening, men spoke of the flight in hushed tones. They passed around copies of the photographs, shaking their heads, tracing the jagged edge of the missing wing with their fingers. Some saw it as luck. Others called it a miracle. By nightfall, the bomber had been cordoned off for inspection. The base lights illuminated it like an artifact from another world. The torn aluminum reflected the glow in broken patterns. The name Hell's Wager faint, but visible beneath layers of soot and frost. Standing near the wreck, a young mechanic ran his hand along the fuselage. The metal was still cold. He whispered something under his breath that no one heard. Later, he would tell others that when he touched the plane, it felt alive, as if the heat of those who had flown inside it still lingered within the steel. That night, the wind swept across the runway, carrying the smell of oil and smoke. The stars above were clear, sharp, indifferent. The war went on. More missions were already being planned. More bombers would rise the next morning, engines droning across the same gray sky. But for those who had seen the crippled fortress land at dawn, something had changed. They had witnessed the impossible, a machine built by human hands defying the limits of destruction, carrying its crew home on fragments of strength and will. In a war defined by numbers, sorties, tonnage, losses, this single flight stood apart. It was not a victory, nor even a success in tactical terms. It was something rarer, proof that even amid the machinery of death, endurance could take on a life of its own. As the hangar lights dimmed, the wreck of Hell's Wager rested in silence. The wind moved gently through the holes in its fuselage, producing a low, mournful whistle that echoed faintly across the airfield. It sounded almost like breath, the last sigh of a giant that had finally come to rest in the years that followed. Hell's Wager became a quiet legend among those who served in the 8th Air Force. The war moved on. New targets, new aircraft, new names, but the story of the bomber that flew home with half a wing refused to fade. It was told in mess halls, in flight briefings, in bars in Norwich and London where airmen gathered between missions. Each retelling changed slightly, as all legends do, but the core remained the same: a dying machine that refused to die, and a crew who refused to let go of it. The bomber was never repaired. The damage was too extensive. Engineers stripped it for parts in the months that followed, salvaging what they could: the engines, the gun mounts, the landing gear. The right wing, torn beyond use, was left intact as a study piece. Mechanics would stand around it in silence, running their hands over the twisted metal, wondering how it had not sheared off entirely. It hung in the maintenance hangar for years, like a relic, its fractures telling a story no textbook could explain. The surviving crew were scattered to other assignments. Some continued to fly. Others were grounded for medical reasons. Most returned home after the war, carrying with them memories they would rarely speak of. They wrote letters to each other at first, brief and formal, signing off with the same dry humor that had once filled the airfields of England. Then, as time passed, the letters stopped. The pilot, Lieutenant Mason, lived quietly in Ohio after the war. He never sought recognition, though the Air Force later awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day. When reporters asked him about the flight, he would only shake his head and say that it was the plane that did it, not me. Those who knew him said he never flew again. Decades later, an aging historian pieced together the mission report from faded files in the National Archives. The official language was clinical. Aircraft sustained severe structural damage. 2 engines lost. Crew returned safely. Enemy fighter contact. 1 visual, no engagement. There was no mention of what the men had truly experienced: the silence between 2 enemies above the clouds, the impossible endurance of the aircraft itself. But some stories live in the spaces between records. A photograph survived, taken by a ground crewman at Thorpe Abbotts the morning after the landing. In it, the bomber sits at an angle, the right wing bent upward like a broken limb. The sunlight catches on the jagged metal, and the name Hell's Wager is barely visible through the grime. Behind it, the English countryside stretches out in calm indifference, as if unaware that the machine before it had come within seconds of disintegration. To the untrained eye, it is just another war photograph, one of thousands. But to those who know, it holds a quiet gravity. You can almost sense the movement that has just ceased, the momentum that still lingers in the air. It is the stillness after chaos, the exhale after survival. Years later, aviation engineers would study similar cases, aircraft that had returned against all odds, sometimes missing wings, tails, or entire control surfaces. They would explain it in terms of aerodynamics, weight distribution, lift vectors, and structural redundancy. Their explanations were precise, logical, measurable, and yet none could quite account for the intangible element, the instinct of a pilot who knows when to let the machine fly itself and when to fight it back into obedience. The B-17, they said, was overbuilt. Its frame could absorb unimaginable punishment. But that explanation, while true, misses something deeper. Machines alone do not persevere. They respond. They react to hands, to will, to the human belief that motion itself can defy destruction if only long enough to reach home. In the small town of Thorpe Abbotts, a museum stands today where the airfield once buzzed with bombers. Visitors walk among rusted fragments of aluminum and faded flight jackets behind glass. In one corner, a section of wing hangs suspended by wires, dented, scarred, with rivets missing. The placard beneath it reads simply, "Section from B-17G, Hell's Wager, 1943." Children pass by it without stopping. Tourists read the description, nod, and move on. But sometimes, among the older visitors, one pauses longer, an aging veteran perhaps, his eyes scanning the lines of the metal, tracing the scars. He does not need the words. He recognizes what it is. He remembers what it means. In the archives of the 8th Air Force, thousands of names are listed under lost. Entire squadrons gone without trace, recorded only in serial numbers and mission logs. The ones who came home rarely saw themselves as heroes. They were survivors of circumstance, carried back by luck, by skill, and by machines that seemed to share their will to live. The war in the air was unlike any other. It was fought not on ground that could be held or surrendered, but in the void between gravity and endurance. For the men inside those bombers, the sky was both battlefield and coffin. Every mission was a roll of fate, a wager, as the name of that battered aircraft foretold. And yet, amid that chaos, there were moments that transcended destruction, fleeting, fragile gestures of humanity. A German pilot sparing his enemy, a dying machine refusing to yield, a crew, half-conscious, guiding it home on fragments of control and fragments of faith. Historians often speak of technological triumphs, of radar, engines, alloys, tactics. But the true legacy of the air war is something less tangible. The stubborn endurance of those who fought it, and the thin line between annihilation and mercy that they crossed again and again. When the remains of Hell's Wager were finally scrapped, a few pieces were kept as souvenirs. One small fragment of its fuselage, a curved panel from beneath the cockpit window, ended up mounted on a wooden plaque, its aluminum surface dulled by time. Someone had engraved beneath it a simple inscription, "Home against all odds." That phrase, more than any statistic or citation, captures what those men achieved. Not victory in the conventional sense, but survival against probability, a defiance of physics, of fear, of war itself. In the end, every bomber that rose into the European sky carried with it the same question. How far could courage carry steel before both reached their breaking point? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the wreckage but in the silence that followed. The long, quiet after the engine stopped, when men stepped out on a frozen ground and realized they were alive. The last of the crew of Hell's Wager passed away many decades later. Their names are carved into small headstones across America, unassuming and identical to thousands of others. But in the memory of those who knew their story, they are more than names. They are the embodiment of something that cannot be measured in medals or missions. They are the echo of an engine that refused to die, the trembling of a broken wing that still held its shape, the whisper of air over metal at the edge of collapse. If you stand today on the old runway at Thorpe Abbott's, grass now growing through the cracks in the concrete, you can still hear the wind move through the empty field. It carries with it the faint hum of what once was, the engines, the voices, the heartbeat of a war fought far above the earth. And if you listen closely, you might almost hear it again, the low, steady drone of a fortress flying home through the dawn, half a wing missing, its shadow skimming the clouds. It was more than a flight. It was a testament, because sometimes, in the darkest hours of war, survival itself becomes the greatest act of defiance.